right, that concludes the preliminary or primary committee agenda. Save the last item, which is comments from the public. So I would ask at this point if there's anyone from the public who would like to comment on this or other matters to please come forward. And identifying yourself for the recorder.
Oh, sure. Does this work, or do I have to turn it on?
The little red button should go on there.
Press it again.
Sure, no, turn it.
There we go.
Turn the knob.
Okay, I got the red light. Is that okay? Okay, well, thank you for letting me comment on this. I'll make it as brief as I can. My name is Jim Leslie. I'm a community member. I live in Christina Lake. I do also quietly, as quietly as I can, run the local medicinal cannabis dispensary. So I do serve people with a need for medical cannabis with doctor's recommendations. So I'm just here to provide a little bit of commentary on this particular issue. My background is criminology and law enforcement. I was a 10-year border service officer with the Canada Border Services Agency. I retired last year to do what I'm doing now. So in regards to this, let's just get right down into the meat and potatoes, so to speak. This isn't about the medical use at all, I understand that, and the safety and efficacy of medical use is very well established. There's reams of evidence, but let's get down into some actual statistics here. We can go back to last year, and there's something called the Global Commission on Drug Policy. Now there's groups within countries, now there's groups coming internationally, and what they're actually doing is talking about the corrosive effects of drug prohibition on human rights, dignity, community safety, and generally speaking, society as a whole. I'll just read you actually the first sentence from the executive summary of what's called the War on Drugs report of the Global Commission on Drug Policy from June 2011. I think the first sentence sums it up quite well. The global war on drugs has failed with devastating consequences for individuals and societies around the world. 50 years after the initiation of the UN Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs and 40 years after President Nixon launched the U.S. government's war on drugs, fundamental reforms in national and global drug control policies are urgently needed. There is a direct tie between prohibition and violence. Direct tie. We actually have evidence now, and I'll move to that immediately. There is a report, and this was done, I believe, in 2010. It's called Effect of Drug Law Enforcement on Drug-Related Violence, Evidence from a Scientific Review. Now, this is published by the Urban Health Research Initiative of the British Columbia Centre for Excellence in HIV/AIDS. The panel that produced this study is amazing and wide-ranging. We have a lot of notable doctors and academics and, I believe, ex-law enforcement on this. Now, what this actually showed, these guys, they did a wide-ranging study. They looked at all the evidence, studying drug control policies and violence and crime. And what they found was there is a massive association between increasing law enforcement priorities and violence. They're tied together. When you increase one, you necessarily increase the other. There's reasons for it. I'm going to just, if I can have a little bit of time to read a quote from a police officer in Victoria, BC. His name is David Bratzer. He's serving right now, I believe. You're talking about a profession where people accept a risk of being murdered, execution style, as an occupational hazard. How is a mandatory minimum sentence going to deter a person who already accepts the risk of being shot and having their body dumped in a car? That's where we are. We're essentially becoming known as the Columbia of North America. We know what's happening in the streets. We know that the gangs have increased in number and in size. And why is that? That's because of prohibition. When you prohibit a substance like cannabis, which is essentially non-toxic and literally benign in most cases, you expand its value, grossly inflate it. So what you have is the state criminalizing cannabis, which is enforcing a value-added tax, which is collected by the drug dealers and enforced by the police. It's unfortunate, and it goes against the common sense of prohibition. We try and control a substance by criminalizing it and keeping it away from youth and vulnerable populations. But I can talk actually from personal experience. I had occasion to grow up in the Fraser Valley, where a lot of the violence over the last few years has occurred. And there's a guy I went to school with, actually, in elementary school. His name's Clay Rouge. He is the leader of the UN gang, and he's doing 30 years in prison right now in the United States. He wasn't extradited, but he was actually caught flying back from Mexico. It's all through the press. But you look at what drug prohibition does. Here's a kid I went to school with. I went to his birthday parties. Where along the road did he get access to so much money to start a gang, and to start buying weapons and cocaine and helicopters and lawyers, and it goes on and on and on. They're better funded than the police, and that's sad. And the only reason is because of drug prohibition. It's the grossly inflated value of black market cannabis. And the silly thing is, this stuff is essentially safer than tap water and table salt. And we've given it this gross value that we can take it. Unfortunately, it can be taken down into other countries where, the United States is close to us, just across the border. They're a source for guns and cocaine. And because this trades at such a high value, that's what we see. This is part of the reason we have such an influx of cocaine on our streets. That's why every time you see a large bust, the price doesn't change. The supply doesn't really change that much. I can remember in 2006 searching a vehicle at the border and finding 80 kilos of cocaine hidden in a false compartment in the bed of this truck. Now that was 80 kilos. That's a lot of cocaine taken off the streets. Do you think it had any effect on the price or the availability even to children? Not at all, not one bit. And it's really unfortunate. As we see in the study here on law enforcement and its effect on drug policy, it's so counter to common sense at this point. The evidence is in. The only problem is leadership. And again, at the federal level, that's quite correct. These are the acts of legislation that control the status of these substances. But I think that people in our communities, the first people they go to for representation would be municipal government. And next the province, and of course then the federals down the line. What they're looking for, I think, and as I talk to people in the community, everyone's against drug violence. Nobody wants to see marijuana in the hands of children. Now, if we can regulate it, and not sell it out of grocery stores, but regulate it properly in a tax-regulated system, you would take the value out of it. It could go down from $250 to $300 an ounce down to $30. No one's going to be trading in that to buy guns or cocaine or heroin or anything else. And what these guys get off on is marijuana is actually the most commonly used illicit drug around the world and in our country. So that's a very large customer base. There's not a lot of people, statistically speaking, that use cocaine, heroin even less, methamphetamine even less than that. So what's the big customer base? It's marijuana. And the longer it's kept criminalized, that allows this inflated value to keep funding this machine of crime and hard drug trafficking. Now, in regards to marijuana leading to other harder drugs, that's only correct in the case of drug prohibition, because dealers who sell marijuana, they sell ecstasy, they sell cocaine, they sell heroin, and they don't check IDs. There's nothing about the biochemical effect of cannabinoids or marijuana on the human body that causes one to require or to move on to hard drugs. Now, in 2002, the Canadian Senate commissioned and released a massive, wide-ranging report, and we seem to do this about every 30 or 40 years in the U.S., Britain, Canada, India, and we look at cannabis and we study it, and we come to the conclusion that it's actually quite benign in most cases. Now, in 2002, this wide-ranging report talked about the gateway theory, and in particular, the head of this panel, Senator Pierre-Claude Nolan, a conservative senator, I might add, mentioned that across all the studies they did and all the experts they talked to, and when you look at the base statistics, you have, for instance, this many people have used marijuana in their entire life. Now, how many people out of that group have used cocaine or heroin? It goes down. You can barely measure it. There's no connection whatsoever. Now, we can further remove that if we separate And that's what the Dutch have done. That's what they've done in Spain, Portugal. They understand harm reduction in the sense that if you can separate the largest consumer market for so-called illicit drugs being cannabis from the hard drugs that actually cause harm, that's a big, big step. And taking that money away from organized crime is number one priority. As I said, they're well funded. There's one more story I'd just like to share in regards to law enforcement. When you have drug prohibition, of course, well, there's a lot of money to be thrown around. And that means you can buy officials, you can buy judges, you can buy MPs. There's issues with prohibition causing corruption because of all this money available. There was an incident, actually, I believe, back in the 1980s in Quebec during all the biker wars and the bombs and the cocaine trafficking. And there was a drug section, I believe, of the RCMP, and they were tasked with addressing this major issue to public safety. And it actually turned out, this is from an Yves Levine book, by the way, approximately 80% of the unit were on the take. It's just when you're in that situation, you're seeing millions and millions of dollars come past you every day, and you're not getting anywhere, and you're not getting anywhere. Unfortunately, human weakness comes into play. And that'll kind of tie into my last little example here. When I started working at the border in 2001, just prior to 9/11, there was an individual I met, a good young officer. Now, unfortunately, somewhere along the way, somebody got to him. He was turned. He's actually doing time now in the United States. He was extradited. He was, according to the court records, waving in shipments of cocaine and motorhomes for an organized crime group that was contracted by some chapter of the Hells Angels in the Lower Mainland. That's extremely serious. That level of corruption, that's just front line. You know, when there's that much money, it doesn't just stop at the bottom rung of the ladder. It can go all the way up to the top. It's a tragic story in every sense. You know, his peers and co-workers feel betrayed. You know, how many kilos of cocaine made it into the community and onto the streets, right? How many more could be out there? This is a constant question. And if, again, we bring it back to the prohibition of these substances. And to take away that corrosive effect on law enforcement, and quite frankly, there's been a decrease of respect, I think, overall for law enforcement because they've been tasked with enforcing these ridiculous laws. You know, if you talk to a lot of police officers or border officers or corrections officers, the list goes on, a lot of them will share privately and some publicly now that drug prohibition doesn't work. It's exactly like in the days of Al Capone, but I do believe it is worse. And it's getting worse in our streets. We can see it. So I just saw the headlines in the newspaper the other day. There's some gangsters just to be released from prison who have apparently been responsible for some of the gunplay back in 2008. You know, we're still under a system of drug prohibition. And I do fear for friends and family who live down in the Lower Mainland. It's a terrible thing. And exactly what Mayor Taylor's speaking of happening in the Slocan Valley, it's the old push-down, pop-up effect. When you crack down and you have harder law enforcement in one area, guess what? They just go over here and pop up here. It's just like when they started cracking down on opium production in the Golden Triangle. Well, it pops up. They started growing poppies in Colombia and South America. Push down there, it pops up in Afghanistan. Now they supply 90% of Europe's heroin. That's the way it is. That's the way it's always been, and probably the way it will always be until we get some form of regulation. And I really believe that a letter like this, Stop the Violence BC, it's a nice grassroots statement that representatives of the people can get behind, not because they agree with consumption of drugs, but because they agree with public safety and properly regulating the consumption of said substances, in particular cannabis, which I think would make a world of difference. And I'll leave you with one last little statistic here. These are the numbers that we're looking at. I mean, we already have an industry in British Columbia that's so huge. We have a 2008 BC Business Magazine estimate that places the provincial marijuana industry at $7.5 billion with a labor force of over 250,000 people. Well, sorry, but that's far beyond control. We need to regulate that. And you know what? There's a lot of people in there who are in there for their own good, and there's a lot of people doing bad things with the money they're making, and there's a lot of people not paying taxes. And that's a big, big deal. But primarily it's public safety and keeping the stuff out of the school grounds and behind counters and blocked doors where it should be made available to adults. So that's pretty much the conclusion of my comments.
Thank you very much. Councillor, you have any questions for the... Okay, thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you.
Further comments from the gallery? We will have another question period in regular council meeting as well, but I welcome any other comments.
I'll try to be quick. Most people who are doing drugs continuously on a regular basis, they look at pot like drinkers look at wine. How many long-term wine drinkers end up drinking the hard stuff, the 5 stars, the scotch and stuff like that? Most of them just stay with their wine because that's what it is. Stephen Harper doesn't know me from a hole in the ground. If I wrote him a letter, I'm sure he'd never see it unless I did something really egregious for it to come to his attention. He doesn't speak for me. The premier of this province doesn't know who I am, and I doubt that I'll ever meet him or her. And then if I do, I'll just be one more face in the crowd. They don't know me, they don't speak for me. You guys, you speak for me. If there's going to be pressure put on the federal government, where's that going to come from? I mean, you guys, you speak for us. And there's a lot of people in this community who don't really feel there's anything wrong with pot, even though there's a law against it. Now, like he said, BC is considered the Columbia of North America. Here's an anecdote. I won't say who told it to me, what little town, I'm sure everybody knows who it is, but the Hells Angels are around your town, they have grow-ops, they put a lot of money into your town, they buy property there, and guess what? You got a school, a small little school, it's a small little rural area, you don't have an awful lot of money, and there's somebody who comes to the parent-teacher meetings that you're kind of scared about because you know they're probably a Hells Angel, but then they hear this thing about how your school could use this or that little thing there, and the government is not giving you what you need. And you come to work one day, you're the principal, and there's an envelope with $5,000, $10,000. Satisfy your needs. What are you going to do when the people who are making ungodly amounts of money can just throw around this stuff like it's just the cost of making nice with the locals? Well, what happens there is that's erosion of democracy because they're buying goodwill from the people around them while they engage in horrible organized crime. They're not necessarily crapping right there, but let's say that same Hells Angels has a whole other kid from a whole other family, and he's old enough to be a real jerk, and he comes to town, and he creates problems. Well, what's going to happen? Are the people in that town going to say, oh, call the cops on that guy? Or are they going to go, oh, well, let's just kind of not worry about it because they help us out? That's how it happened in Colombia. There are whole cities in Colombia where the narco-traficantes, the drug lords, pay for hospitals, they pay for schools, and the people in those towns would rather have them there than the government's cops. Because when the government's cops come around, things get bad and people get shot. That's all I'm saying. It's bad. You guys speak for us. If you guys don't speak for us and put the pressure on the federal government, I know it's not going to happen from the provincial government. The problem with politicians is they're looking at the next election. They're not leading. They're worried about what's going to happen. How are they going to be perceived in the next election to the voters? Well, gee whiz, how are you going to be perceived 15 years down the road when, gee whiz, you could have spoke up, do something about it, and all that stuff that we see happening in the Lower Mainland is happening throughout BC. That's all. I just think it's something I should do.
Further comments from the floor? Again, Nigel, did you want to?
Good evening, Worship Councillors. My name is Nigel James, and I've lived in Grand Forks for just over 3 years. When I first came to Grand Forks 3 years ago, and a little bit, directly opposite to me lives a member of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I met him as a neighbour, and I chatted to him and said, well, what are the problems we've got in Grand Forks? Not knowing much about it. And he said, basically, drugs and grow-ops. It obviously has not changed too much. So that's a bit of the background. Now, tonight, I'm rather surprised that more of the councillors didn't have some opinions on this subject, because it's a subject which is coming home. It's been around for as His Worship said, for 8-10 years or so, and I would have thought that you as our leaders would have had some opinions on it, for or against or whatever, and would have been willing to open your mouths and discuss it. That disappoints me. It's often said that a politician's job is to get himself re-elected for the next term. And perhaps by opening one's mouth, you put yourselves into potential jeopardy. But however, that is up to your conscience. Looking south of the 49th parallel, as I understand it, and don't quote me on the facts because I'm not sure on my facts, but I believe about 2 million Americans are incarcerated for probably marijuana offences. What a waste. What a waste of time. Those 2 million equates to 6% or roughly of our population, which roughly equates to the number of unemployed in the country, in Canada. What a waste. We have to do something about it, I believe, because it won't go away. And it's up to you, amongst all of us, to write to our members of Parliament, MLAs, our City Council, and whatever else it is, and get something downward moving. Get a general opinion in the country of which way we should go. And if it is generally decided that we go to the left, then we go to the left. But let's not sit on our backsides and do nothing about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Nigel. Further on this topic this evening from the floor. Hearing none, I would accept a motion to adjourn the primary committee meeting. Councillor Smith and Councillor Wires. Would it be your desire to take a 5-minute break?
Yes.
5-minute recess before we reconvene the regular meeting.